Yeah, we are live now.
Okay, good morning and welcome back to the fourth day of the Citizen Science Conference. Thank you for staying with us all these days. My name is Suhail. I'll be moderating this session. And this session, as you know, is going to be on diversity and inclusion in citizen science. And this theme has come up because of discussions in the previous conference last year, where this was identified as a major topic and as a barrier or a challenge for those of us who work in citizen science. So subsequently, a working group was put together to talk about these issues and to come up with a document about them. So this is members of the working group on diversity and inclusion are identifying major barriers for people to engage with citizen science, and as I say, working for a document with concrete recommendations and guidelines for the community. This is a work in progress, and so in this open house session, the working group will present their thoughts to the larger community of citizen scientists, and then we'll incorporate all your inputs into the final document. So I'm just going to briefly introduce, or actually just say the names of the people in the working group and then over to them. So the members of the working group are Kaveri Kargupta, who's from the Slender Loris Project, P. Jagannathan from the Nature Conservation Foundation, Naveen Nambudri from Dakshin Foundation, Prashant NS from the Institute of Public Health, and Sneha Dharwadkar from Freshwater Turtles and Tortoises of India, as well as from Oklahoma State University. So they will be giving us a presentation, a brief presentation on their thoughts, followed by an open session where anybody is free to answer questions, sorry, not answer, but ask questions. Also, you can answer them as well, and comment and so on. Let's have a general discussion. So over to the working group for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suhail, for that. Let me share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. And so here we are. We will be discussing about what we've been discussing since April this year in a group like Suhail has mentioned, diversity and inclusivity in citizen science. So India is a large country and beautiful wildlife we have everywhere almost, and also we have huge amount of people, and that's why the citizen science practitioners we all excited about, and we reach out people and do various citizen science projects. And when we look at it, this slide you probably would have seen in yesterday's one of the yesterday's meeting. Ram has given this similar slide, and in three major citizen science initiatives: India Biodiversity Portal, iNaturalist, and eBird. And if you see, there is a huge amount of information from south, as well as you can see the dots clustered mainly in the city, and there is a huge amount of gap. And this also, it's not only about like people say, the distribution of birds is not, or any animals is not the true distribution of that animal or organism. It's a distribution of that the human beings reported that. So we can also say that we have not reached out as a community, the citizen science practitioners. We have not reached out at, in these places. That's why there are no information coming out, and that's the purpose of the whole purpose of this discussion. And we talk about decolonizing science, and when we talk about that, we should be talking about inclusion, diversity, equity, and justice as a solution. And it's very important to understand and identify what leads to the exclusivity in the citizen science initiatives. And also we should be identifying all these things right in the beginning, ideation, creation, and implementing stage. And so this is the background and main purpose of the whole group. And I'll be talking few aspects, whatever we have discussed as a group, and other group members will be joining in this soon. In the beginning, we discussed more about what is citizen science itself in Indian context. So in 90s, people from West um, participatory research methods in social sciences, they define sort of this is the citizen science. And then, but in India, it's very badly interpreted. Even though we would have seen Professor Madhav Gadgil's talk on the first day. And we never called that, in the beginning, we never called the term it as a citizen science, even though we have history of participatory research in India even before that as well. And we initially discussed about what are the motivations by both the initiators as well as the beneficiaries and the participants to participate in the citizen science project, as well as to start some project. I mean, as a practitioner, many people it will be mainly data driven. Like, okay, I want to find out the dragonfly distribution of in my district or a state or a country. So I reach out people. But what are the motivation for the people to participate in that? And what are the factors influencing the longevity of the participation? Have we done enough for that? And then what are the demotivating factors? So these are some of the things we discussed. And then we realized that there are quite a lot of information and studies available across the world about the motivation of the participants, but motivation of the initiators, especially in the Indian context, is not there. So it will be a good study to do later on. Oops. And then we discussed about the diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. This will be covered by my colleague here later on. Do we really, what do we mean by diversity? And then what do we mean by inclusion and all these things? So, and then we have also discussed about yesterday we had an amazing session by Ram, and he discussed about this how rural area is not being represented in the map of the citizen science projects. And we also discussed about how inclusive we will be in gender wise. And you can see that it's a nice icon, says that it's gender neutral, as well as you can have all the disably able people can use this bathroom. But the next slide share, if you look at the whole picture, it says only for the customers. So that's not very inclusive. So that sums up. So we can think of the similarity between our citizen science programs. We are doing it in our projects as well. Are we really gender neutral and it's inclusive for everybody? And quickly, we found this interesting cartoon artwork on the net, and this sums up most of our work. Imagine that you're running a citizen science project. That's a tree, for example, eBird or whatever, since I'm familiar with. So I can use it because I know birds, I know I can speak English and I can write English. So I'm using app, but the other person who doesn't know all these things cannot reach out. So, okay, I'm giving him app or her app and teaching the birds and stuff like that, but still there is no internet connectivity. So what will you do? Okay, you're giving the equity. The next part is you're giving, doing everything for that. You're customizing the tools that identify and address the inequality. But is that balancing both the side to everyone? Justice. That's where the justice comes. So here you can see that the last part, justice is fixing the system to offer equal success to both tools and the opportunities. So that way, we have to think about all these things when we are talking about. So in the initial phase itself, we should be thinking about all these things when we talking about the citizen science. And we also discussed about sustainable participation, how to sustain the participation with the volunteers, how long, how can we engage them in a longer run. And then we also discussed about, identifying biases. This will be, explained a bit more by my colleagues, Sneha and Kaveri as well. And then we discussed that we should assess this things, and then right in the beginning we have to plan these things right in the beginning before we start the citizen science projects. And also the language, like Ram has very nicely put this, just because there is, the language is not in the language which I can understand or everybody can understand, people cannot participate in this. So how much we are doing towards it. So that's very important. And then ableism. So only certain certain portion of people can only attend this kind of or participate in this kind of things, that should be removed. So these are the discussions we had. And then now I'll hand it over to my colleague Kaveri, who can take it forward from here. Thanks.
Be unmuted. Thank you, Suhail, and thank you, Jagan, for the introduction part. So I am going to talk today about inclusion and diversity, equity, and also justice. One of the things that I want to ask to the audience who are participating in this workshop is that what do they think of inclusion when we think of inclusion in terms of our research or in the community. So I think, I don't know whether any of you can answer my questions here. I would love to have the answer from you if you want to participate in the Slack section or send the questions to the moderator. So when I think about inclusion, I think about inclusion is that including everyone in the community, going actually in the community and talking to people, talking to people from the community that we generally won't talk. Since we are from the middle class families or urban middle class families, we don't really go down and talk to the villagers or to the people who are working in training up our communities. So I don't know, when we talk about science, do we really talk about doing science with people who are working class or who are working and cleaning up our communities or participating in, for example, even selling flowers in the market? We don't, right? We talk about inclusion, we talk about diversity, same thing in this picture. You can see the diversity of diverse communities. India is extremely diverse compared to other countries. But how many of these people we think are participating in science education or doing science, doing any kind of research? Again, we don't. Equity. What about equity? I think India is one of the most unequal society. Maybe some of you may not agree with me, but look at, we don't really have just the class and gender and race. Our main barrier is actually caste in terms of when it comes to equity. And same thing with justice. We talk about justice, but where is our justice? So if you think about all of these things in our day-to-day life that's happening, then how do you think we can put all of this together in our citizen science research projects or citizen science projects? They all are citizens, but are we actually using or taking everyone from these communities, or even looking at this picture here all of them, we expect them to participate in our citizen science research or biodiversity conservation research? We don't. We don't really know how to even do it. So what I want to say is, let's think about how we can actually do the inclusion and equity and justice in terms of doing citizen science. And I think what we'll do is I'm not going to talk to you about all of these things right now. I think I would participate in the discussions. That would be better. So here we are talking about what is inclusion. I want you to read this when you have time. But after that, what I think I want interested in talking is about how and where the research ethics comes from. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, research ethics comes from. So ethical research ethics in research is very important, as Lisa Rasmussen talked about it in the plenary the first day. There are many types of ethics that we have discussed during our working group. One of the things that I really think is important is community partnership. It's so important. We want everybody to participate. We want community members to participate in citizen science. But what are the ethics do we have for citizen science to participate? We don't really have much ethics in even regular research, in the sense that human participation in regular research. So regular biodiversity research. So I think it would be really good to have think about how we are going to have ethics when or ethical regulations or rules when community people or community members are participating. Biodiversity environment is another one. We know we have issues with, for example, forest departments or communities, who are living in the forest, about ethical issues in how we are using our biodiversity, and we always have the conflict between people and researchers, between forest department and researchers. So we really need to again think about how citizen science will have these real ethical norms or rules for biodiversity and environmental conservation issues. Social justice is another important thing in citizen science, because there are a lot of projects where community participates. Communities, we can sometimes call them community science or participatory science. Some of those projects are actually for especially environmental issues, for justice of the community members. So here also we need to think about how we are going to actually create ethics for while we are doing environmental research on environmental issues, especially like there is some pollution or there is some conservation issues. For example, like we are doing urban research and we need to do conservation of certain species, but that would actually hamper some lifestyle of some community members. So how do you do this ethical issues in those kind of projects, or those kind of research? Do citizens get the preference, or the animal gets a preference, or can we actually stop the pollutions or some kind of other air quality or water quality issues, and who are the beneficiaries? So in those cases, social justice ethics should be created. Human subject, again, I mentioned before, the community, working with community members. Lisa also mentioned human subject ethics. So who are the people? How do we communicate with them? How do we get permissions from them? Do we really need to get some conversations going with them? That also we need to figure it out. Publications, who are the members who are going to be the authors if we publish any of these of our research? Do the citizen scientists get publications too? I mean, they would be the co-authors too or not? We don't know. We have various different issues in many of these different projects. I, for example, know that our Urban Slender Lorries project have participants, citizen scientists who are part of our co-authors core team. So we need to figure those things out again much more clearly. And then the code of ethics for harassments. This is one of the things that I really talk about a lot. Sexual harassment and any other harassments are big issues in our research, both in India and in globally. But do we really have any policies for harassments? I'm not sure. And especially because of citizen science is a new field, and we are out there, researchers and citizen science participants are out there doing field work, doing research. We really need to figure out, again, a strong ethics, strong code of ethics for harassment issues. I hope we are going to think about all of this. I'm not going to take too much time. I want you to discuss later in the discussion part. Now I'm going to give to Sneha for talking about the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Kaveri. I thank you for bringing us to this very important topic of ethics in citizen science, and talking when we talk about equity, diversity, like representation matters. And when we talk of equity, where we talk of fair and just practices for everybody, including all, despite of their gender, caste, creed, religion, it is important that we look at some of the barriers that and gaps, the gaps that are currently uh, that are there in citizen science. If you look at, if we analyze the current citizen science projects, not only in India but many of them globally, it we can largely divide our gaps into these parts, where we can categorize them as physical, where people are physically, whether they are able to participate in the citizen science projects. There are technological challenges, there are economical, there are financial barriers, who can participate, whether your financial status allows you to participate or not. There are societal barriers, like from what community do you belong to? Are there any restrictions for that person to participate in the citizen science? There are cultural aspects that are related to this. And next slide, please. If we look into details that are the current barriers, and Chagan, can you please go to the next slide? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Sneha.
Jagan, can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So we need to look at some of the barriers that Jagan talked about, the motivating factors that include people, that motivate people to participate in the citizen science. But what are the factors that prohibit people to engage effectively in citizen science projects? So one major challenge has been literacy. When you talk of citizen science project, it involves data. So it's not just language literacy, where if like majority of the projects that are based on technology, at least, which require you to upload data or at least feed in data, majority of the data has majority of these projects are in the language that are not usually that is not usually accessible to a large number of population, a large population in India. Like majority of our citizen science projects, like eBird, and even my project, Freshwater Turtles and Tortoises of India, relies very heavily on understanding of the language, but also the numbers. How many people are able to engage effectively in terms of looking and documenting at data? And then this brings us to the next level, where how many of them have access to connectivity, where this is a two-way process, where whether the citizens are able to engage themselves, and also whether the practitioners are able to effectively reach out to a large amount of population. So this is a barrier, which is a two-way barrier. Like all the barriers that we talk is majority in the sense that it effectively applies to everybody. And then technological barrier, we talk about digital India, but there is a great digital divide. Not everybody has the same access to the technology that that a small amount of people possess. And that is why a large amount of our citizen science projects, as we saw in the maps by Jagan and by Ram in our previous sessions, is that if we look at the projects, the data coming out of many projects are largely concentrated to urban areas which have a population that are majorly literate, that have access to technology, electricity, internet, that has population which can effectively engage in citizen science because they are also because they can also financially participate in the projects. This is one thing that people think that, oh, if you have money you can do it, but there is also a matter of time. If you are running hand to mouth, there is very little time for you to effectively participate in such projects. Then when we come to cultural biases, there are so many cultural biases. um, Being of a certain gender can prevent you from participating. Women especially, Ram's talk especially talked about how there is so little representation of women. Yeah. So this is one thing. Language of data science, I already talked about how numbers is something that can effectively prohibit you from participating. Then a large amount of citizen science projects in India are carried out by institutions, and individuals who are not affiliated with these institutions can be effectively removed from that. Ableism is something that Jagan already talked about. Able-bodied people are able to participate in biodiversity-related citizen projects more because of the access, because of the clear access. And then there is legal barriers where certain people are not able to access certain areas because of the legal restrictions. So there are so many barriers currently that prevent people from participating in citizen science. So we as practitioners have to make sure that we take into consideration of all these barriers and design a citizen science project that can at least mitigate some of the issues. So I will hand it over to Naveen now, who will be talking about the ideation and framework of citizen science projects.
Thank you, Sneha. Yeah. So while we were working on the document, we also felt it was really useful to try and put down a very broad framework. This is not, the objective is not to be very prescriptive on how you structure and build a citizen science project, but rather what are those things that you need to take into consideration, especially from a equity, diversity, justice and yeah. So on the theme that we're working on. So the way we kind of split it up is into an ideation stage. It's really critical to think about before we initiate a program. It's really critical to think about what are the, what is the expectation and motivation, mainly for the initiator of the program. There's a, if you look at the citizen science literature, there's a lot talked about what are the motivations and expectations and incentives for participants, but very little has been done on why, what is the motivating factor for the people who are initiating these programs. So it's really critical to think about whether are you looking at data, are you more focused on getting people to have better learning outcomes through engaging in your citizen science program? Is this to counter a certain issue on ground? So all of these issues are the so it's really critical to honestly sit down and reflect on what exactly are the motivations and and your need as well, not just the motivations. What is it that you're trying to get out of it? And it needs to be an honest introspection. And along with that, because of all the issues that earlier speakers spoke about on inclusivity and diversity and equity and all of those issues, it's really critical to look at what is the motivation for the participants as well. What are they expecting from this engagement? Who are those participants that will be participating in it? If you know clearly what are you trying to do, you can clearly kind of visualize and try and figure out who are those people who potentially can participate in it. So if it is a tech heavy project, or if it is something that requires a lot of numerical literacy or language literacy, English society. So then you can also think about how to work with language barriers, all those barriers that Sneha talked about. How do I work around those different barriers? So that's at the ideation stage. And at the creation stage, there are, sorry, Jagan, can I just finish? Sorry, there are a couple of more. So also at the creation stage, it's really useful to think about how do you want to create the thing. Once you've thought through what's your motivating factors, then think about what it is. How can you create this? It could be either a co-created initiative where you entirely build it bottom up through a lot of consultations, engagements, and make sure there's enough participation and all of that. Or it could be to also define very clear rules of implementing a citizen science program. Often it's not possible to kind of foresee all of these, but at least it's good to think about what are those potential issues. It could be, sexual harassment related issues. It could be safety related issues. It could be a lot of different issues. But so how do you kind of build a rule of engagement while you're creating your citizen science initiative is also very, very critical. And that's also applicable in the implementation stage as well. A lot of this is laid out in the document. Because of time constraints, I'm not going into the details of it. We can discuss about that in the discussion section. Next slide, Jagan. Sorry. Yeah. So it's good to think about it in terms of when you say citizen science, where is your focus relying heavily on? Are you focusing more on the citizen aspect of it, or are you focusing more on the science aspect of it? It's not to say that this is better than that, but it's really critical that you think through it. You could have a spectrum of science heavy, completely science heavy kind of a citizen science initiative where only a certain strata of the society can engage in. It only renders so much of flexibility because your objective is to try and generate data or generate the knowledge that's needed for it. So you may end up with a framework that is inherently not wielding to better inclusivity and all of that. But how do you work with those things? How do you make it within your limitations? How can you make it more accessible, more available for the participants? So that's the objective of this. It could be along a spectrum of very science heavy, completely science heavy, to a completely citizen heavy on where is it that you're posing. Move as much as possible towards the center where there's a balance, both sides, the citizen as well as the science aspect of it. Next one, Jagan. Yeah, so like I said, this is not to be very prescriptive, but some of these things are not very obvious, like issues of equity, justice, and inclusivity. All of these are not very obvious because your motivation is to start this initiative with whatever objectives you have in mind. So quite often these things are not very obvious. So the objective is to try and bring in a lot more focus on this. Also, it can be very varied. What you want to do with your program it can be varied. Like I said, it could be on different ends of the spectrum. So it's really critical that you have a very clear, honest, and reflective articulation of what you're planning to do with your citizen science initiative. And it's pretty much basic, basic things, right? Like what you expect when you are engaging with anyone else, you should make that available when you're building your own program. So stuff like accountability, transparency, and justice is not such a big thing to expect, because I've heard a lot of people say that, hey, I'm only interested in the data part of it. Why do I need to worry about all the other parts? Whoever is contributing is coming in as, because they're volunteering to it, they're being altruistic. Why should I, bother about too much of inclusivity and all of that? That's not my objective. But honestly, it's not such a big, or if you're comfortable with that, that's well and good, but you should at least be very transparent and upfront about those, what to expect and what not to expect from your citizen science initiative. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap up there and we can move into the discussion section. Jagan, you want to take over? Suhail?
Yeah, does any of the working group have anything else to say? Otherwise, we'll move on to the discussion.
I think we can move on. Just that, if people want to take a look at the outline document, it's there out in the Citizen Science website. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all of you for your hard work on this. And I think this is going to be a really important document. And all of us who are involved in citizen science initiatives in India are looking forward to it and will be able to learn a lot from it. We have until just before 11 to carry on this discussion, so about 20 minutes. There are questions or comments coming in on Slack, and I will use my prerogative to pick and choose. So some of these may not get addressed, but I hope that the panel will interact and address those comments in Slack later on. I think there's a couple of comments from Ram that I want to start with, which are really interesting. And just to paraphrase, I think the thing is that inequality of opportunity and participation in citizen science, in part or maybe in large part, reflects inequalities in our society. So he says that this is going to be hard to address because some of these inequalities are sort of built in, or maybe not built in, but at least have not been solved in our society at large. So those biases are going to be hardest to address, he says. In particular, he talks about local projects, locally driven projects, what we might call community science. Then it's not enough just to say, well, something should, a project should be locally driven. Sorry, can't hear me? I'll bump up my mic. Yeah, is that better? Can others hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hey, I couldn't hear, Suhail. I couldn't hear the last part.
Okay, so community-driven projects also can be dominated by or captured by dominant groups within the local communities. So we know even within the local situation, there is great inequality. So for example, a local project may be dominated by men, like we've discussed in this, or it could be dominated by upper castes or landholding class or things like that. So there again, Ram says, it's maybe not enough just to say that projects should ideally be locally driven, but even there care needs to be taken for some of these principles to be upheld. So that's just a comment by him, but I wondered, and since Prashant has joined us and Prashant wasn't part of the presentation, whether, Prashant, from your experience, how severe is this concern? And in your experience, what are some of the things that we can do about this when even offering our services as scientists to local groups?
Yeah, I don't know whether the connection will hold up. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Suhail, and thanks for the team members who made an excellent summary of what largely many of them have been. I'm also a member of the team. I wish I could have contributed more. But anyway, back on this question, which is, I think, very interesting, because merely changing citizen science to community science, perhaps, and imagining that communities will behave better than what scientists or academicians have, may not probably solve the problem. Because when we say community, scientists also come from the same community. And we, in fact, reflect the same hierarchies and biases, perhaps in an amplified way, because we have a larger platform, we have a higher platform, and we probably do more damage when we reproduce, often unintentionally reproduce the same kind of structures that have benefited us in the first place. So I think the document already makes that point. Coming to the practical things, what I have found helpful in my practice is the ability of the scientists, academia, to receive criticism is something that I have been working on. It's often very difficult because we are used to criticism that is in the form of a peer review. And also, although on social media we talk about how peer review can be brutal, working in communities should give us some humility about the brutality of peer review, because the framework within which communities operate exposes a lot of vulnerabilities we often have. So I think that's really, I mean, without laboring on that point, I think the primary learning for me has been to accept vulnerabilities and to open ourselves to fairly brutal criticism of work that we might have passionately put together. And second thing is that I found is often the easy path, the most efficient path, which we often prefer. Uh, Often is also uh, uh, sort of anti-participation. Often participation by nature and design is often not efficient. Um, and working within project spaces and institutional boundaries that we have, we often make these efficiency choices which we make in the name of program efficiency, but actually they also tend to be against the spirit of participation and this thing. So sometimes, I don't know, maybe what has helped me is to frame outcomes as things that we think as process. To give an example, merely having a large number of women and a large number of, let's say, Adivasi contributors, a large number of excluded contributors, merely having them participate in the platform should also be an outcome that you can celebrate, and not always whether their participation led to an interesting data and a paper or an insight or this thing. So maybe these are two sort of things that come to my mind. But I think there are no sort of easy solutions. All of these involve a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of difficulties. That's what I can.
Thanks, Prashant. Actually, that's an interesting point at the very end, where I think you were saying that inclusion and inclusivity should be or can be an end in itself, not just a means to an end. And that is, I think, a shift in thinking that many of us will need to make increasingly. Maybe some won't, as the working group has said. There's a spectrum of projects, and some may value inclusion and some may not. But I think a really important point that Naveen made at the end was that you may position yourself somewhere on that spectrum, but you should at least be aware that that spectrum exists. So I'm also a fan of making one's own decisions, but making them with full awareness and information, not making decisions unaware that you're making those decisions of exclusion. For example, most of us in the beginning, when we start out, we are making these decisions unconsciously that we're excluding people. But I think this discussion and the paper that will come out and these conferences and all the churning that's happening is going to be very useful in that way. There are a couple of other questions, and I encourage others to please post on the Slack thread. There's a question about inclusion in particular. Suppose following this, some of us, we want to put in place measures to increase diversity, inclusivity in our projects. How do we measure our success? How do we measure our progress in that? So are there metrics of inclusion, inclusivity? Prabhakar asks. And of course, we've talked about multiple dimensions of excluded groups and so on. But is that something that the working group has thought about? Will it be in the document? Perhaps I can put this to Sneha.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to bounce off to what Prashant was saying and connect it to the earlier point where he said that like just getting people on board, like getting women on board or getting certain communities on board itself should be a matter of like celebration, because it doesn't have to be like, oh, how much they contributed. What important point that we mentioned, like we discussed in the initial section, was that the matter of parachute science. We talk about parachute science in terms of the global north coming and participating in the global south, and then moving, like dropping off like a parachute and then moving on without engaging with the local researchers or train communities. But it's the same for the urban elite academicians or the citizen science practitioners who would just take the data and then not engage with the communities. So to that point, where how do you develop a matrix, was something that we discussed in terms of how are you going to, like, knowing what your project, knowing the barriers of your project, how your projects, like for example, my project is currently only targeted to people who can access technology because they have to upload their data online. So I know that this is a barrier, and this is where I can work around a solution where I would actively reach out to communities who do not have access to technology, and then making extra effort from my side. So these are some of the things we did talk about. And maybe Naveen can talk on the metrics a little more than me, because he had developed something on those lines, and we have made it we have put it in the document, but I think Naveen would be able to describe it a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, Naveen, just a couple of minutes, then we can move on to another point.
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky thing to develop these metrics because it depends on what exactly would you like to capture in your, you know, in your through the metrics. And for specifically for inclusivity, you know, it depends on I think it's very difficult to generalize given that the spectrum is so broad. So depending on which side of the spectrum you are on, for instance, if you want to do a very strong community driven kind of an initiative which is trying to address a particular issue in a small area, then like Prashant also mentioned, there are within community variations, and to make sure that you have a complete spectrum of inclusivity. I really tried breaking my head over building some kind of a metrics, but honestly, it's been a difficult thing because it could be problematic as well, in the sense that
I
you
think
try
it
measuring. Go ahead,
yeah.
Kabir.
No, I was
Um,
just going to say that it also helps to keep regularly evaluating the projects to see how you are doing.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Kabir, yeah.
Sorry. I was just thinking about that. We need to have project specific metrics. So, for example, if you are a community based, if you are doing a community based project, then there will be a different kind of metrics as opposed to, for example, eBird. So, for your season watch versus, think about season watch versus eBird. We should have different matrices based on specific areas and specific projects. That's what I think we need to develop. We need to focus.
Yes. Thanks, Kabir. Actually, Prashant has made a comment here in the Zoom chat, which all of you at Slack can't see, but I'll ask him to say it out loud. A very important comment, I think.
Sure. I was just listening to the metrics, the call for metrics, which is always very useful snapshot of what we did and how we did things. But rather than metrics, what I push for is a framework, which is declared a priori before a citizen science engagement. And the reason is because for me, this inclusion is a reflection action cycle. So you act and then you reflect. What did I do right? And invariably, what did I do wrong? So iteratively over time, you keep on pushing the inclusion boundary. So this is more a reflective practice than a set of indicators.
Can you very quickly give an example of this, Prashant?
Yeah, for example, we have prepared a toolkit, in fact, in public health. It's not in citizen science for participatory action research. And this is very similar. Citizen science is really a participatory research activity in that sense. If you take a quick example, looking at the space that we create and who speaks in the spaces that we have created. So you go in, you create, let's say, you have small gatherings for bird watching, or you have tree watching sessions. You do, say, 10 sessions, and then every 3 months, you meet and say, okay, the spaces that we created, who is there and who is not there. And secondly, among those who is there, who has a voice and who does not have a voice. So you can create these kind of frameworks at the very beginning, and then every 3 months meet, and we can be sure that we will not do it right, even if we have the framework correct, and we keep learning like a reflective practice in a reflective practice format.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Iterative frameworks is what Naveen has commented over here. So I think that's very useful for us. That here again the means and the ends are sort of intertwined. The framework is a means, but it's also an end. The fact that you're iteratively interacting with the community, you're using that as a way to evaluate inclusion, but it's also an end in itself. So that's really interesting. I'm used to separating these two things very clearly, the means and the ends, but I really find this very, very fascinating. We just have a few more minutes left, but somebody, Prabhakar and Ram, have talked about the trust framework that Dr. Rasmussen talked about. But I wanted to come to a comment by Farida, or a question. So, this document is going to be very thought-provoking, have lots of very useful recommendations for all of us in citizen science, but of course, in the larger endeavor of science as well. And Kaveri has commented separately that citizen science is more complicated than your establishment science, where you may work in the lab, or the participation is much more restricted. So these interesting thoughts that are in this document, that will be in this document, how do we spread them? Is it that we do so through the community of people who work on them? Should it be some top-down mechanism, trying to influence policy in some way, policy clearly promulgated by a larger, more powerful body, government or something like that? What are your thoughts on how the ideas here can filter through into practice? And I'll leave this open to anybody who would like to address this from the panel.
Hey, I can jump in here.
Yes, Kaveri, yeah.
I think policy comes later. I think those of us who are doing the citizen science as a scientist or through institutions or individually, and the practitioners, the citizen scientists themselves, we need to have first training. I don't think top-down is the only way to answer it. We need to have both bottom-up and top-down. We need to actually discuss with them first. And that takes a lot of effort and time. Not all of us, all scientists are good at talking to people. So we need to have, mediators perhaps when we don't know how to, we don't know how to talk to community members. So I think, we need to start the practice at home first. And given that citizen science is brand new in India and as well as in other places, we talk about doing this kind of training first or discussions first before we move on to separate things. So people who are interested in doing citizen science projects, please, do come and talk to others or want to have some meetings, something like that. Maybe we can even have a toolkit. That's what I think.
Okay, thanks, Kaveri. Anybody else who would like to add from the group? No? Okay, so everybody agrees work starts at home. We among the community, we discuss and we put together the thoughts. I don't know whether to call them guidelines, but their ideas, their thoughts, their frameworks, their ways to think about this issue. And then we come back next year or the year after that, and we see how we've done. And maybe we can follow this up with another session next year at next year's conference, where several of us can reflect on what has happened in the past year and using some of the frameworks that Prashant has described, maybe some metrics that of course we know are very crude and won't be perfect, but still so that we know if we are at least going in the right direction and so on. I think we're out of time. There are a couple of other comments that have come in late, but we're out of time right now. If there's any closing, like few second thoughts that any of the working group would like to make, the floor is open and then we'll close the discussion. Naveen, it looks like you are Jagan, yeah.
Yeah, so the outline is there, and if anybody in this forum would like to add something, would very welcome to come and comment on it, and please write to us, and we will take it forward from there.
Yeah, so this is meant to be an inclusive process as well.
Yeah.
Clearly, there had to be some smaller group of people who started off this conversation, because it's very difficult to do it in a large group or in the public. But now that there's an outline in for this, anybody is very welcome to engage, and you can engage as shallowly or deeply as you would like. I'm sure the working group would really welcome it. So thank you. This is a discussion that obviously doesn't end over here. It has to continue. It's part of how we live our lives, not just how we do our work. So let's keep talking about this and keep reflecting on this. So thank you to everybody in the working group for all your work, and especially during this time. I know your work started just when the second wave started, or at the peak of the second wave. It's been very hard for all of us and for you to dedicate time to this, but I think we all really appreciate it and your presence here today. So thank you so much. So that brings us to the Jagan, yes?
Yeah, we would like to thank Akshata for everything, and also all you guys to inviting us to do this, and it's been an amazing learning experience. So yeah, special thanks to Akshata.
3 cheers for Akshata, as always, for the entire conference, for the working groups, for everything. Thank you. Okay, so that brings the open house to a close. We've closed the house. Um, the I want to say a few things before we move on to the next session, and the next session will start in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to remind everybody about two open things, tasks for you or requests for you. One is to please post your feedback, and there is a form. The link to that form, the feedback form, is in the announcements channel, is in one of the most recent messages in the announcements channel. So whenever you have a few minutes, it shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, please do fill out that feedback form, because there's no way in which we can improve the conference without your critical feedback. So compliments are always welcome, but criticism is equally welcome. So please do say how we can improve the conference the next time. And the second point also, which requires your input, is the directory of citizen science projects, which we launched yesterday on the website. This is a highly incomplete directory, and if you run or manage a citizen science project, please do go and add your project to that directory. And again, the link to do so is in the announcements channel. So please go ahead and do that whenever you have the time. And I will turn it back to Akshata, I guess, for the next session. Thank you all for being here.